The sixth mass extinction. Climate change, zombie viruses, and AI dystopias are just a few of the major threats humanity faces today. But it seems that we're not done with World War III yet. Only this time, instead of fighting over land, the superpowers are preparing to wage war in space. So how exactly do the United States and China plan to destroy each other on the moon? You've probably seen enough sci-fi movies to know that the moon is an ideal place for a lunar base. Not only does it have plenty of resources, but it's also relatively close to Earth, at least compared to Mars. Although living on the moon will be pretty tough, experts think that with the right preparation, people could survive there permanently. So far, 6 nations have claimed parts of the moon as their own. The Soviet Union kick-started the trend back in 1966 when they first released their claim. Then the US did the same 2 years later. China even had a go in 2019 when they submitted a document to the UN claiming sovereignty over the moon. But the moon rush isn't about planting flags and staking claims, it's about mining. In fact, the entire world is getting into lunar mining. And if you want to get rich in the next decade, you should consider joining them. Let us take a look at why so many countries are heading to the moon and what they intend to do once they get there. Why are so many countries mining the moon? If you ask the Chinese government, they'll tell you that it's because the moon has tons of valuable resources. This includes rare earth elements such as scandium, yttrium, and lanthanum. Helium-3 is another useful resource that can be harvested on the moon. We can use helium-3 to generate huge amounts of clean energy on Earth. There's also water ice to consider. The moon has plenty of it, and we can use it for drinking, farming, oxygen generation, and rocket fuel. All in all, the moon is one of the richest places in the universe. But it's also very difficult to reach. For this reason, no country has been able to mine the moon on any kind of large scale. However, recent technological advancements may finally allow us to do this. One of the biggest breakthroughs came in 2020, when NASA confirmed the existence of water ice in the shadows of the moon's south pole. Sure, this is hardly a discovery. We suspected that the moon contained water ice long before this. But knowing it for sure is a huge deal. That's because there's no international law regulating lunar mining. But there is an international law regulating the extraction of celestial bodies within Earth's borders. So if NASA can prove that the moon has valuable resources, then they can lay claim to those resources. This is likely why the agency worked so hard to confirm the presence of water ice. NASA already plans to send astronauts back to the moon in 2024, so they might as well bring some mining equipment along for the ride. Some experts believe that NASA could begin extracting resources from the moon by 2030, and they won't be the only ones. The Chinese government released their plan to build an international mining station on the moon in late 2020. They didn't say when the station would be built or who would be involved, but they did invite other nations to join them. When it comes to harvesting the moon's resources, the Chinese have a big advantage. Their Chang'e 5 mission landed on the moon in December 2020 and returned 1 kilogram of lunar regolith to Earth. The samples were immediately taken to an advanced laboratory in China, where scientists began analyzing them. So while NASA is still scrambling to bring astronauts back to the moon, the Chinese are already working with what they have. The private sector is also jumping in on the action. Their goal is to mine water ice and use it to produce hydrogen and oxygen. Then they'll sell the oxygen to space agencies and the hydrogen will be used as rocket fuel. The company believes that they can make this whole process profitable within 5 years. And that's just one example. There are a ton of companies out there looking to cash in on the latest gold rush. Of course, not every single one of these projects will pan out. But it's safe to say that the future of mining belongs to the moon. So which countries are the biggest contenders for lunar mining? The United States is the most powerful nation on Earth. They've sent humans to the moon twice, and are planning to do it again very soon. With all this experience under their belt, it's no surprise that the US is a top contender for lunar domination. However, they face stiff competition from the rising superpower China. The two went head-to-head during the Cold War and ended up racing to the finish line. The Soviets launched the first satellite into space, and the US was determined to win the race to the moon. When Neil Armstrong first stepped foot on the lunar surface, he famously said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." Less than 5 years later, the Apollo missions would end, and the US would lose interest in the moon. China, on the other hand, has never stopped. In fact, they've sent over 50 missions to the moon since the 60s, whereas the US has only managed 8. As such, China now knows much more about the moon than the US does, and their knowledge will undoubtedly help them become a dominant player in the new space race. Both countries also have the financial resources required for lunar mining. The US has spent over $200 billion on NASA since 2000, whereas China has spent around $25 billion on their space program. Unlike the US, China's budget hasn't decreased over the years. In fact, they're spending nearly double what they did in the 2000s, so China's expertise and massive funding give them a huge edge in the upcoming lunar race. But there's one thing that the US has that the Chinese don't, and that's previous experience. We've already mentioned that the US went to the moon 5 times between 1969 and 1972. What they may not have told you is that they also landed 3 unmanned spacecraft on the moon before that. Add to that the fact that the US owns the largest rocket ever created, and you can see why they're still a force to be reckoned with. But let's not forget about the underdog Russia. Back in the 60s and 70s, the Soviet Union made huge strides in space exploration. They launched the first satellite, the first space station, and the first space shuttle. Unfortunately, the USSR would fall apart before they could put a man on the moon. But that doesn't mean that the Russians aren't still a contender. They've sent dozens of missions to the moon over the years, and have been remarkably successful. Out of the 20 missions they've launched since 1991, 17 have been successful. Russia also has another big advantage. While SpaceX and Blue Origin work on their Starship rockets, Russia's Soyuz 5 and Angara 5 rockets are fully operational. The Soyuz 5 rocket can launch 15 tons to the moon, and the Angara 5 can launch 20 tons. So when it comes to the size and power of their rockets, the Russians are in a league of their own. Now, here's the problem. Russia has been struggling financially for quite some time. This has affected their space program as they've had to cut costs wherever possible. As such, they haven't been sending many missions to the moon recently. From 1991 to 2009, they sent 7 missions to the moon. But since then, they've only sent 2. If they want to compete with the Americans and the Chinese, they'll need to start investing in their space program again. So how will the battle for cosmic resources play out? Back then, the US and the USSR competed in every aspect of space exploration. The Soviets beat the Americans to launch the first satellite in the first space station, but the Americans eventually caught up and then some. They went on to land the first humans on the moon and put the first woman in space. But after a while, both countries realized that the space race wasn't healthy for either of them. They decided to call a truce and work together on the International Space Station. It's possible that something similar will happen with the new space race. After all, the ISS has taught us that working together is usually better than competing. On top of that, lunar mining is dangerous and expensive. It would be in everyone's best interest to work together and split the cost. Of course, that's just wishful thinking. Chances are the moon rush will be just as cutthroat as the original. The US and China especially have a history of bickering and starting trade wars. Plus, both countries have gotten pretty comfortable being the top dog. It's unlikely that either one will want to share the spotlight. In the end, the winner of the lunar mining rush will be whoever can adapt to the harsh conditions on the moon. It's cold, dark, and deadly. Whoever can overcome these challenges will become the new superpower. We've seen how space exploration can bring nations together. Now check out why Yellowstone's supervolcano eruption is inevitable and when it will happen.